welcome everybody to a new episode of the Coffee Breakdown podcast. Today we have an episode with Maurizio Giacomin. Maurizio recently got his PhD from PFL in Lausanne, and now he's postdoctoral researcher in York, in the UK. And actually, so this episode will be about, crazy theory and numerical methods, mostly related on
crazy,
fusion.
but...
Well, crazy. Depends how you define it, so we'll see. This is why also Aaron also is here present, I think, to have a lively discussion. So first, thank you, Maurizio, actually, for your time and for your interest in participating at this podcast.
But thank you, Luca, for inviting, and hi all.
Yeah, so maybe you can start introducing yourself. I mean, we know each other actually from the university in Italy, but maybe you can say how you got into this topic, into fusion, and what you're doing a little bit, and yeah.
Yes, so actually, yeah, we worked together in the university. Actually, studied physics in Padua, and then I did to the PhD in fusion. But my interest in fusion energy actually dated back to already high school level, when I sort of started looking at. So it's really like a long way up now, and actually I was fascinated by all these alternative energy sources, and already like sort of captured by the what is now, I mean, a pressing issue, and actually started looking at something like solar energy, wind energy, and I came across fusion energy. Of course, at the time I didn't know anything about fusion, and it was sort of confusing, So I decided to dig into in details, or try to sort of understand, and then I came to the point where I say, okay, I would really like to sort of know more about this and learn more about this. Then when I ended up, when I ended the high school, I sort of decided to go to university and study physics. Actually, I wasn't sure about physics because my first choice was, I think, more engineering, or better, energetic engineering. But then I moved to physics because I was wanted to do something like more theoretical stuff, and like to have a basic understanding of physics and the plasma physics. But of course, then throughout the university, I had the opportunity to follow some courses. We were together actually in some plasma physics courses, and I got very interested in these courses and decided to do more. So at the end of the university, well, we actually had the opportunity to do our master project within fusion. Well, that was at IPP. It was a great IPP in Munich, so Max Planck Institute. It was a great period. We stayed there. And if you remember, Luca, we had to choose among different projects, and there were two projects related to fusion, and one project was related to, well, it wasn't fusion, it was CO2 conversion. And we discussed a lot among us, say, okay, which project we'd like to take, and so on. And then I thought, okay, I want to do fusion, so I will keep one of the fusion. Then you decided to actually take one that was outside fusion. You kept this CO2 conversion project.
Lucas a trader, that's all.
Yeah, and that's why then I liked what I got done. And then I keep doing that during my PhD, and that was at EPFL in Lausanne,
Actually,
Switzerland.
okay, so this is interesting. Sorry if I interrupted, because you started and in a similar way, I mean, already from bachelor and then master from neutral beam injectors, right? And then you moved actually to the study actual machine, so the tokamak. So why did you decide to switch from, kind of fusion oriented to actual fusion type of machine?
Well, yes, right. So, well, MBI is still like fusion oriented, because MBI kind of mostly applied to fusion energy to machine, like in tokamak to ET plasma. But I decided to move more into the tokamak physics because I thought like, okay, I want to learn more about tokamaks, because sometimes when you work on MBI, so neutral beam injector, you are sort of, you can be a specialist of MBI, but without really knowing what is happening inside the tokamak, or maybe you know, but not all the processes that are happening, and you're sort of a bit detached from what is happening in the machine. So that's why I decided to say, okay, I know a bit of NDI or sources for NDI, etc. But let's move to look more at the physics in the tokamak, and that's why then I decided to do a PhD looking at actually plasma turbulence in the boundary of tokamaks. And actually, I'm still working now in tokamak physics, just moving from boundary to the core, but I stay essentially in that field.
Okay, well, maybe we can jump a little bit into that like soon. So can you explain us a bit what are these boundary of tokamaks and so on? I think, well, for Aaron, I think it's really clear, but I come from a different field, right? And also this concept of scrape of layer, I think, yeah, I mean, it's almost it became basic plasma physics, but I think you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So we define the plasma boundary as the external region of a tokamak. So if you think a tokamak, there are essentially, we can divide the tokamak essentially in three regions. One is the core, where we have essentially the high temperature and where fusion is happening. Then we move toward the edge, and the edge region is a region of very steep gradients. So we have to go from the very hot core to essentially the boundary that are almost, almost room temperature, we can say. So there, in that region, we have a very large density and temperature gradients. And then finally, we have the external region, that is a region where the magnetic field lines intersect the wall. So it's a region where we have a sort of all the processes that involve the plasma wall interaction, the heat exhaust, etc. So the plasma boundary is a region that includes this external region where the magnetic field lines intersect the wall, that is called the scrape of layer, plus a bit of the edge. Well, the edge is the region where the magnetic field lines are still on these nested flux surfaces, so inside the tokamak, but in the thin region where we have these very steep gradients. And essentially the magnetic surface that divides these two regions, essentially the confined plasma region to the unconfined plasma region, is referred to separatrix. And the separatrix is sort of something important because there we have essentially the transport physics changing between the plasma inside the separatrix and outside the separatrix. So just since I will talk a lot about these plasma boundaries, so I want to make it clear the plasma boundary is really the external region surrounding the core, which sort of set these heat exhaust for our tokamak.
Okay, and you also have that's quite interesting. And you all have, I mean, the plasma that is there is actually different than the plasma that is in the core, I suppose. And in which extent, actually?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, there are essentially at least some differences. The first one is the topological difference. So in the core, the magnetic field lines are on nested flux surfaces. So essentially, they don't intersect wall, and the parallel transport there is sort of very, very simple. Then when we move to the scrape of layer instead, there we have different topology, where topology means that, okay, first the magnetic field lines intersect the wall, and this already change your parallel transport. And then second, we can have a fancy shape of our plasma in the scrape of layer, and this is done usually to try to reduce the heat exhaustion, the heat flux to the wall. We can have really like geometry which features like more what we call X points, so more region where the poloidal magnetic field is actually vanishing. We can have geometry that very complicated, which involve more of these X points and so on, or or region very extended, where the magnetic field lines are move apart from the plasma, so that we can sort of increase the length of these magnetic fields, so that we reduce the heat flux going to the wall. And the other difference is one other important difference is the plasma temperature. So in the core, the plasma temperature, so the electron temperature, let's say, is very high, meaning that the collision frequency is low, so the collisionality inside is quite low. While in the escape-off layer, the electron temperature is much colder, so it's actually much smaller than what we have in the core, and the collisionality is higher. So this means that the plasma in the escape-off layer behaves more like a fluid rather than in the core, where we see more like the kinetic aspect of plasma. So it's like more a particle aspect in the core, while in the escape-off layer, we treat it as a fluid, or something that can be associated to a fluid.
Sorry, if I just want to jump in here, because maybe it's useful to take a little bit of a step back. Definitely that the edge plasmas are, at least to my understanding, getting a lot more interest in the fusion community nowadays. So clearly there's something there that is important to study, and maybe you can just give us like an overview of like why that region is now becoming so interesting to study. What about it is important to know for, let's say, building a future fusion reactor or something like this?
Yes, right. You're right. That's actually a good point, in the sense that fusion community now is, or well, recently start really looking at this region, because there are sort of several issues associated with that. So first, the first one is, and probably the most important, is the heat exhaust issue. This region is a region where we essentially handle the heat flux to the wall, meaning that we want to keep the heat flux to the wall below technological limit of our material, and this is essential because we don't want to build a fusion power plant that has a very high performance and it's working perfectly, but then as soon as we turn it on, then we suddenly burn our wall or our diverter region, or damage it, and so on. So that's a very delicate region, and we need to really understand that. And this usually comes with a quantity that we define as the width of the escape-off layer. So the wider is
the very like simple question, because there are already fusion machines, right? I think about JET, I think about other machines around the world, right? So why then is it important? Because if you go to larger machine, for example, ITER and so on, you have to withstand like a larger heat flux in terms of magnitude, or why is it important actually to?
Exactly. That's the point, because the reason why going to larger machine is actually because we want to have fusion power episodes. We want to increase the confinement time of our machine, and one way is to increase the size of the machine. So the confinement scale like the size. So we need to be larger machine to have a higher confinement in the core. But on the other hand, this comes with higher power that we inject in the core region, where there is also fusion energy happening. So there is also the fusion power there that is going to be exhausted through the escape-off layer anyway. Yes, we can have radiation in the core, but then some fraction of this power is going to be exhausted through the escape-off layer. And that's why this is more an issue if we think about a reactor scale or a fusion power plant, because there we have large heat fluxes really coming to the escape-off layer and then going to be exhausted. So that's why this region is very important, but it's not the only reason. Another reason actually is that we have to think about this escape-off layer, or in general this boundary region, as a boundary for our course, meaning that if we think like we have to solve this system of equations, usually are partial differential equations. So if we think from a purely mathematical point of view, when we solve our equation, we need boundary conditions for this equation in the core. And these boundary conditions are provided by the escape-off layer. So what we have to do then is to try to sort of model as much as possible this boundary, as better as possible this boundary region, in order to get good boundary condition for our models that then work in the core, where we use then this model, for instance, to compute the energy confinement time that we need to predict performance of our machine. So there are interesting phenomena happening in the boundary. Yeah.
Sorry, but then I'm wondering, so all these studies that started in the past, studying, for example, transport in the core and so on, what did they use as boundaries? Some sort of like fitting or some sort of like, I don't know, like
yes,
if I think I have to calculate like particle density, what do I impose? Like the flux that goes to the boundary, and how do you take that into account?
Yeah, so in the past, like modeling the core, we usually used sort of simplified picture of the boundary, where we say, okay, we have a buffer region. We don't really know what is happening in this buffer region, but we know there are sinks and sources of particles. So we can sort of model very simply what is happening there, and try then to sort of decouple the boundary to the core, inserting simpler buffer. And these buffers can help in sort of performing simulation of the core without really having to deal with the boundary physics. But on the other hand, this comes with some limitation, as you can imagine. For instance, like complex geometries are not really well captured by any buffer region, or other phenomena like plasma wall interaction, like new plasma neutral interaction, and purity and so on, might not be very well captured by this buffer region. So, well, it's sort of working, but can do better if we are able to sort of model together this core and the boundary region altogether.
Okay. And you mentioned, I mean, there are, well, Aaron is much more expert, so I think I'm asking some dummy things, of course, but you know, you have this turbulence in the core and turbulence at the edge. Is there some difference, for example, of this type of phenomena? I'm not expert, so I'm really asking out of curiosity. So what makes the turbulence at the edge like so special and so important to study?
Well, let me say first that, well, tools that we use in boundary and in the core, they are both like complex tools and both equally important. So yeah, we have to study and understand core turbulence as well as the boundary turbulence, of course. Then I mentioned before that actually one difference is the collisionality. So since the boundary or the escape of layer is more collisional, there we can apply a fluid model or a two fluid models where we have electrons and ions, and this fluid model is actually simpler than what we apply in the core, where the collisionality is low. So we need to use a more kinetic model. It's not actually a kinetic model, but it's something similar to a kinetic model. To imagine that is anyway a six-dimensional focal point equation that we need to solve. So in that sense, this makes the model in the core much more complicated than the one applied to the boundary. So that's why we were thinking about, okay, so let's decouple the core and the boundary, so we can address the boundary with a sort of simpler model that we can then couple to other physics at play there. And while in the core, we sort of use all the machinery of a kinetic models or gyrokinetic models to try to get accurate prediction in the core. So the first reason is that we sort of are now using different models applied to different regions of the plasma. But of course, one can argue that in the boundary, we can have also sort of kinetic effects that are not well captured by fluid models. So one can say, okay, why not simply simulating everything with a kinetic model, for instance? That's something that the fusion community is exploring currently. Is quite complicated because, as you can imagine, we go from region of very high electron temperature to region of very low electron temperature, and this poses some challenging that are mainly numerical challenging. I mean, we need to solve this equation in reasonable amounts of time. And then, in addition to the complexity of a gyrokinetic model, then we have to add the complexity of the boundary, which means that in there we have, as I mentioned before, a complex magnetic geometry, then the neutral physics, so the neutral particles that's just coming from the wall, and then we have to deal with boundary condition to the wall, and then all other aspects which make the overall simulation of the full device very challenging. The other approach is actually the opposite. So try to start from the boundary, try to improve the fluid models, adding kinetic effects in there. For instance, like simply taking your Boltzmann equation, then expanding and adding more moments to your equation. This is one possible approach. So essentially improving the fluid models in there to try to capture the kinetic effects in the core. So one approach is going from the core to the boundaries, and the other is from the boundaries to the core. These, of course, are two opposite approaches. They are both being explored at the moment, and but the actual main goal is the same. Is they want to be able to capture this interaction between core physics and boundary physics.
I also am interested in sort of, it's a bit new to apply, let's say, even the concept of turbulence to the scrape-off layer region. I mean, most people have, at least in the past, have sort of assumed there's this kind of laminar-like flow because of the open field lines and the fast, let's say, direction, parallel velocity of the plasma to the divertor region, to the targets, let's say. And so people didn't really care about studying turbulence in that region. And so one question I want to ask is, well, why is there suddenly an interest in, let's say, simulating or studying turbulence in this region? Did they find some, through some experimental study or some theoretical study, that this is important here? Or is it, did people just say, well, we have these codes, let's see what happens?
Well, actually, from experiments, we know that that region is, we have a lot of turbulence happening in that region. And turbulence is essentially generating from the region that is close to the separatrix, essentially. And the fluctuation in there are essentially comparable to the background quantities of our equilibrium quantity. So it's definitely a very much a turbulent state, what we have in the scrape-off layer. And then, as I said before, one important quantity that we need to estimate, we need to predict in future power plant, is the scrape-off layer width, so the width of this region. And the width of this region depends on one hand on the parallel transport, and as you said, this can be think of a sort of a laminar transport, and this is what have been what is essentially simulated in transport cores. But then it's always a balance between parallel transport and perpendicular transport in there. And the perpendicular transport can be of two natures. So one is sort of equilibrium like transport, and another is turbulent transport. Well, there are regimes where turbulent transport heavily dominates over any equilibrium transport or radial drift transport. And in that case, if we wanted to capture correctly the width of this region, we need to account for turbulent transport, and that's why we need cores that are able to simulate turbulence in there, and cores we can use to get an accurate estimate of this quantity.
Yeah, that's right. Because I think like the old estimates kind of, or at least the old scalings for the lambda Q kind of predicted that like a machine like ITER will have such a narrow scrape-off layer that it's basically a plasma knife that's just going to cut right through everything, which is obviously not good. So you're saying that if we include the effect of turbulence, then this prediction gets a bit wider and could say something better for ITER's performance.
Yes, actually, this is a very good point. There is a well-known scaling predicting this scrape-off layer width in a machine, and then if you extrapolate this scaling for machine like ITER or TIMO, other tokamaks, then we end up on very thin scrape-off layer, which is not good, because this will lead to very large heat fluxes. But there were some simulation, turbulence simulation, actually showing that this might be not true, in the sense that turbulence in there is actually larger than what is predicted by the theory of this lambda Q scaling, which is actually based on and the neoclassical transport there. So when we consider the addition of turbulent transport, we end up with a width that is well, can be a factor, even a factor 5 larger. So it's not just a small addition; it's actually a big factor there, which of course is a complete new game changer, if you want. I mean, in the design of ITER or Demon or other tokamaks. So I think these simulation, well, these are very complex simulations because they are at the scale at ITER scale, so also very challenging and very expensive from a computational point of view, but also showing very interesting results in the sense that, well, we should care about turbulence, and we should probably keep doing these simulation in even more accurate way, and as much as we can, really, to the actual final aim will be to sort of modify the existing scaling so that we can account for turbulence. And this is what I've sort of done, this partially in my PhD. We're trying to sort of link turbulence simulation to the scaling law in the scape of layer. But this was done in certain limits, typically in a mode, so with sort of some assumption and limitation. But despite that, still seems to work relatively well when compared to the experiment. So that's interesting. But of course, we will need to sort of keep working on these and try to extend it to regimes that can be more ITER relevant or DEMO relevant. And this is something important. But just saying that we cannot neglect turbulence there, because turbulence might actually play a dominant role.
But maybe, coming back to the model, I would say, for me, at least from my experience modeling low temperature plasmas, even at high collisionality, the holy grail would be if we could apply kinetic models in a computationally efficient way. In some sense, there are some people say, the physics emerge from it. You don't have to impose the physics if you do kinetic models. However, if you do fluid model, you have to put the physics yourself. So it means that you need a theory, for example, or some transport and so on. Is this well developed, actually? Because it reminds me a lot about, thrusters, for example. That, there is not a widely established theory on anomalous transport, for example. And so it's very difficult to have fluid models that are predictive at the end. So is it the same for tokamaks? Or...
Well, fluid models are actually derived from first principles. So these models are derived under the limit of high collisionality, and essentially kinetic models in the limit of high collisionality should retrieve a fluid model. So the fluid model is a limit of a kinetic model, essentially in some parameters, and one of these is the collisionality. So the use of these fluid models actually, they are actually called drift-reduced Berginsky models in the one that we use to simulate the plasma turbulence in the boundary. Are actually well established and have been used for years. So we know that these are working quite well, and we have done validation to experiments. So we are confident that these fluid models are able to capture like the main physics at play there. Now the question is, and this is actually an important question, is will these models still be valid in a regime such as the one associated to ITER or DEMO, where we expect to have large power entry to the scape of layer and potentially large electron temperature and lower collisionality? Well, this is a good question, and up to now there are not a clear answer. There have been attempts to simulate these plasma with a fluid model, but of course there have been other attempts showing that kinetic effects may be more important in that regime, and that's why there is a strong motivation of either extending the fluid model so that we sort of can include these kinetic effects in there without losing too much the fact that we are looking at a simple model, or the other way is to say, okay, let's go and simulate with a kinetic model everything, and of course this is one might think that this is actually the best approach, as you were saying, to say, okay, we have kinetic models, so why do we need to take a limit at high collisionality and retrieve a fluid model? Just apply kinetic models everywhere. But the problem is that, so apart from the computational cost of this model, that is can be prohibitively high, especially in machines like HIT and Demo, but also the complexity in dealing with different physics at play in boundary, like as I mentioned, neutrals or complex magnetic topology, or the interaction to the wall, etc. So there are all these phenomena that one will need to sort of add to a kinetic model or solve a kinetic model in framework. It is not the course. It is not something that we know to do, but it is something like more complex, and we will need to extend what we are doing now. Well, let me say that actually there are already gyrokinetic codes able to simulate the escape of layer and the edge in general. So there have been some promising work, and I think that this is really the next step. So we will have soon a simulation able to capture the core as well as the boundary region together. So this is something we are actually already doing, and there is good progress in that.
Actually, this is a good question, because you mentioned that you have to couple sort of the plasma code, kinetic or fluid, to the neutral code, which is probably usually a fluid. I don't know if it's kinetic, but at least in the like SolPS or these other edge models that aren't studying turbulence, it's just transport. Actually, the coupling of those two physics is not trivial, right? It's quite difficult, especially they operate on different time scales, and then they have different interactions, and then you have to account for more than just collisions. You have ionization and all these electron-based interactions. So it gets quite complicated very quickly. Do you imagine that same problem getting even worse when you try to couple gyrokinetic codes, or is this sort of solved in some way? If you put them both in the kinetic description, then it's not so difficult.
Well, I would say that is at least as difficult as it is now.
Okay, so there's no it's still at least there's no quick easy way to do it.
Well, there are again there are different approaches and different ways to couple a plasma model to a neutral model. So one way is the one that you mentioned, is when using SolPS, for instance, where they solve the plasma equation, and then they couple this plasma equation to an external module that is provided by different codes, so typically Irene or another code able to solve the essentially the dynamics of neutrals using, for instance, Monte Carlo codes, or can be a different approach like using the fluid neutrals model, etc. And so there is really a physical coupling between the two codes. So one is doing the plasma equation, the other is doing the neutrals equation, and then times to times they exchange information and then can advance the physics. Another way will be to take the neutrals physics and embed it into a plasma model. This is another approach. Is actually an approach that you can still exploit the different time scale of the phenomena associated with the plasma turbulence and with the neutrals dynamics, because it's actually happening in a different time scale. Neutral time scale is usually much slower than the turbulence time scale. So, and of course, we don't want to solve the neutral dynamics in the same time frame of the plasma dynamics, because this will be like over solving the neutral dynamics with a lot of essentially resources just being wasted, while there is no real evolution of neutrals quantity. So this decoupling is always there in any way, but I mean can be implemented in a very different ways, just that I want to mention. So when we go to gyrokinetic models, then we have to think of, well, we're already solving a very complex equation on time scale that is, of course, the one imposed by turbulence. And then it will be to take these neutral models, can be kinetic models or fluid neutral models, and provide anyway some additional sources to our gyrokinetic equation. So the idea, I think, will always be to keep the two things interacting, but never solving them within the same time frame, to avoid, actually, as I said, over solving the neutral dynamics and exploiting this time scale separation. And then we have another time scale even larger, that is the transport time scale. Transport time scale is actually much larger than turbulence, so we are talking about order of magnitude difference in time. So meaning that when we apply our turbulence code, can be turbulence code in the escape-off layer or can be in the core, we are never able to get to the transport scale because this is simply too expensive. So what we actually do is to study turbulence and understand transport and predict fluxes, etc., but never assess consistently evolving profiles in the transport time scale. So profiles can still evolve because of turbulence, so we can simulate how they will relax, maybe because of turbulence, and what is then the impact on the heat fluxes. But then evolving a full profile on a transport scale is simply too expensive. So there will be an additional coupling where we actually couple a turbulent code to a transport code. And this way, turbulent code will actually provide fluxes, and then the transport code will take these fluxes from turbulence code, evolve at transport scale, and then injecting back the profiles to the turbulent codes and so on. So, and this is something that has been proved to be quite efficient and to work relatively well. Yeah.
Yeah, this is common also in low temperature plasma. So typically we have what we call the gas flow dynamics model that can include the turbulent transport of the neutrals. And then it's coupled to a plasma model. In fact, there is sort of much lower time steps effect. Or you can even couple the dynamics of ions and electrons depending on the plasma you have. So it's interesting anyway. But can you, like, back to the coupling, like you also have to couple probably, I don't know. So do you have to couple the core and the edge? You said yes, because you have to provide boundary condition, but do you need really a coupling of the model, or you can just run the model of the edge and the output that you get, you use it as input for your core model?
So yes, that's actually
you need like point. Dynamic coupling.
Yes, exactly. So there is one attempt, at least that I know, coupling core code to a boundary code, and this coupling is really done as you said physically. So we have one code evolving the core, and another evolving the boundary, and then they exchange information. Yes, this is one option. The thing is that when we do this coupling, we have to be extremely careful in capturing the interplay between the two. So let's imagine that we have a region that is very close to the region, the core, that is very close to the boundary, where we have steep gradients in there, and we expect to have a lot of turbulence. Now, this turbulence goes to the escape-off layer and is generating in the boundary. So now the boundary cores must see the turbulence coming from the core and then be able to evolve the transport in there. So what we actually refer to the known locality of transport. So transport is actually generated from turbulence generating from something else, somewhere else, and then it's just convected to another region. This is something extremely challenging because you have to deal with sort of all these buffer regions in order to be able to mimic well the effect of boundary codes in the core codes, and vice versa in a boundary code. You have to model what is happening in the core. So this coupling, I mean, there is at least one attempt that I know, and I think they managed to do actually this coupling. But that was extremely challenging, and also motivation for doing this full tokamak simulation, or try to actually simulate both the core and the. It seems like simpler, as we have all the ingredients there, just one code, and we know how to then couple the two things, since they are coupled within the code itself.
Okay, that's good. Also, another concept we have, for example, in our community is scaling, because sometimes you have this reactor like quite big, and you have to solve maybe kinetic. You need a mesh resolution, very, so then the computation is very heavy. So So typically what people do in our community is just to scale, to reduce the dimension of the size, but keeping kind of the same geometry. But it's not clear actually if the physics is also preserved. So this is also a question. So is it something that you do as well when you do like kind of full, it's like a mini tokamak? or do you actually simulate the full dimension?
Right. So I know, yes. Well, the concept of scaling, I think, is, well, at least in plasma physics, is a bit everywhere. And the thing is that having a scaling is, well, it's very powerful, because we can sort of study even the experiments. I mean, we can study an experiment that is at a small scale, and then just say, okay, now I want to extrapolate this to larger scale. So before even running the experiments, I sort of know what is going to happen just using the scaling. So scaling are very powerful in that sense. And fusion community and plasma physics community in general, they really like having scaling. But of course, there is also the question you are saying, that is a scaling, okay, scaling can be applied essentially everywhere at every scale. And that's a problem, because when you do a scaling, usually you assume some modeling there, and these models come with some approximation, and the validity of the scaling is heavily linked to the approximation that you use to derive the scaling. So the first things that you need to check before applying the scaling is to ask yourself, are these approximations still valid at larger scale? Because it might be that actually they are not valid. So you are breaking some approximations, so you can't really apply the scaling, even if sometime one may be tempted to say, okay, I want to apply it anyway because I don't have any other way to do, and then so let's apply the scaling and let's hope that things will stay the same. But yes, driving scaling is actually something that also in fusion community is done often, and can be scaling, for instance, derived from experiments. So we have different experiments, different scale, and we just fit these on a multidimensional parameter space. Or it can be scaling derived from theory, for instance, first principle scaling. I mentioned before scaling of the scape of layer width. There are a bunch of scaling for that, and it's interesting because Aaron before said, well, this scaling predicts a very thin scape of layer for a machine like ITER, but then we run simulation and we end up with a width that is much larger. So obviously the scaling seems not to work. So what is going on there? And actually there are some approximation that seems not to work very well at that scale. For instance, this is just an example. So scaling are very powerful, but we need to be careful with not extrapolating beyond the validity of the approximation done to derive the scaling itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting because it's also basically the core of modeling. It's not just running codes. It's not just, you know, making weird or very expensive calculation. You also have to take into account the approximation that you put in your model, right? And the validity of those. So it's very, very interesting. Okay, maybe.
And if I may add, actually, is also when you actually go from your full model and you derive the scaling, usually you have to do some approximation. So it's not like, okay, let's have a scaling out of a kinetic theory. So usually you have to simplify your model. And while simplifying your model, you add some approximation in there. So it's something that, like, okay, it's not like running a full kinetic simulation. Now it's sort of, okay, let's reduce the model. Let's try to have something simpler. I can work on analytically, for instance, and then derive a scaling. And in that derivation, there are approximations, so usually that are important, and this approximation must be then checked when you extrapolate your scaling.
Okay. Aaron, do you have other questions maybe on the like physics fusion part? Curiosities.
Yeah, well, I think there is still something that I did want to mention to you that I think you mentioned earlier while we were talking another time about the density scaling limit, right? This is something that you came across in your work, that you found that by calculating the turbulence in this edge/scrape-off layer region, that perhaps this density scaling that we used to apply can be sort of overcome or surpassed. So maybe you could explain a little bit about that to us.
Yes, sure. So let me first explain what density limit is. So density limit is actually well, as say the definition is a limit on density we can achieve in a tokamak. So this limit has been around for more than 40 years, and since first experiments, physicists realized that actually there is a sort of maximum density, and we cannot go beyond this density. Otherwise, we have what we call disruption. So we actually lose the plasma current, we lose our plasma, and this is not good, and we have to avoid disruption, especially at large scales. So there have been a simple scaling describing the density limit around for as I said, 40 years. And in this, it is a very simple scaling, saying that the maximum density can be achieved is essentially proportional to your plasma current. So higher the plasma current, higher the density you can achieve. So since then, this phenomenology of density limit is related to sort of some MHD activities that then lead to disruption. The community first thought that actually this density limit is set by a core condition. So it must be an MHD limit, so it must be something related to the core, potentially to the radiation of the core. Well, there have been some theory building on this, but recent experiments actually show that we can overcome these density limits in the core by, for instance, injecting pellets. We can have a very peak profile, and we can go beyond what is the empirical limits of density limit derived by Greenwald, so we can exceed this density limit by, for instance, injecting pellets. And from experiments, we actually see that the limit is rather imposed by the edge, by the boundary, and not the core. So, meaning that boundary physics is definitely important for density limits to explain the whole. Now, based on that, we actually there are two main different ways we can think of a limit to the boundary. One is a radiative limit, so it can be still something imposed by the boundary, but from the radiation. So as we build up the density profile, we're actually injecting more neutrons in there, so there'll be radiation, and this radiation will make profile collapsing, and then as profile collapses, we have all these MHD activities coming in, and then a disruption. And the other way is that actually, as we build up density, we increase, for instance, collisionality, we increase the neutrons interaction, and so on, and we therefore increase turbulent transport. And while we increase turbulent transport, our profiles will just decrease until they collapse, and then we have all these MHD activities again appearing. Well, so what we've done is to follow this second approach. So start from a turbulent model, able to describe transport at high density, and try to see if there are regimes where we can have these profile collapsing. And we found from simulation that this is possible. And there are some cases we can actually make profile collapsing, just increasing turbulent transport in the edge. So we were able to derive a simple scaling, so analytical scaling out of this based on turbulent transport. And we actually found that this scaling was working very well when compared to experiments. We compared to different tokamaks, and we actually saw that this was doing a good job. This scaling is kind of sort of similar to what is the empirical scaling. So the main dependence is still on the plasma current. So higher plasma current, higher the density we can achieve. But in this case, the density at the edge, and not the density in the core. No. But we have an additional dependence, important dependence on the power. And this is good news because we know the power is going to be higher in ITER and demo. So we expect, therefore, to actually have a higher density limit, which means we can achieve higher density in the core and therefore higher performance for fusion.
Right.
Well, this actually, if we do a simple estimate, then considering ITER parameters, it ends up that the density limit in ITER predicted by this scaling is about a factor 2 larger than the empirical scaling. So it's a
wow. Okay, 2 times. Yeah, I was not expecting that. Yeah.
So that's good. Of course, again, one can argue and question the validity of this scaling at ITER scale because it is based on some approximation that are valid for present-day tokamaks. But as we move to ITER, again, kinetic effects might be important. There may be other effects. Radiation can be important as well, and so on. So when we have this scaling, there are also other scaling derived on sort of similar approaches and so on. But then the main question is always, okay, are these scaling or can this scaling be safely applied to ITER and DEMO? Well, this is still a question, and we hope we will be able to solve this question at least based on simulation.
Right. So there's still a risk that there's another physical phenomenon that makes the limit, let's say, lower than 2 times, right? Like it might be closer to the limit predicted by Greenwald with these other phenomena. But I'm also interested then, like, did you identify, let's say, the type of turbulence that causes this type of density collapse that occurs from your simulations in the edge? Is it a type, like a mode of turbulence that is well known within the turbulence community, or is it a completely new thing?
No, it is actually a well-known mode, and is a resistive mode. It's what is called the resistive ballooning mode, essentially. It's a typical mode that we have in the boundary of tokamak. You can see it in different machines, different sizes, and so on. And it's essentially due to resistivity. It's a mode that is driven unstable by resistivity.
Okay, so this is why when the density goes up, it gets more, let's say, unstable. Yeah.
Exactly. So actually, as you increase density, you increase the collisionality. Then there is also feedback on the temperature going down, because when you increase the density, you actually do by fueling, for instance, you also decrease the temperature, and this increases the collisionality. And transport driven by resistive ballooning mode is proportional to the collisionality. So higher collisionality, essentially higher turbulent transport, and this is why we have this feedback mechanism that can be at play. And when we sort of hit a certain limit, then you start your transport is so large, then essentially you see a cooling of the entire boundary region, and this comes with a change in your current profile and triggers then MHD activity. So we were able to link this to well-known turbulent regimes. But I would like to say also that, well, this is what we found in our simulations, and what we also think, what we have considered to derive our model. But actually, there are also other models saying that there might be also other types of instability depending on the regime we are looking at. For instance, the role of the electromagnetic effect is still very debated. There are people saying that electromagnetic effects may be actually important there, so we should also retain these. While what we see also in our simulation is that electromagnetic effects are less important. So it's all it's still a topic of in under development, and there have been still a lot of work we are doing.
Yeah, definitely.
This dependence on power, this can be tested experimentally as well, without going to ITER, for example, or?
Yes, it has been tested. Yes,
it has been, okay.
These experiments. Yeah, this was actually one of the key dependence that we want to test, since given the importance in in predicting then for future tokamaks. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, very, very cool, actually. Maybe, we can end the topic, the discussion. It was very intense, at least for me, very new, a lot of new concepts. I'm still
but very interesting, very interesting.
Very interesting, very
it's
interesting.
a totally new field, and I'm also interested in learning a bit more about it. So
also, I'm really glad that this edge part is becoming more and more popular, because there are a lot of atomic molecular processes that are relevant, plus sputtering of material and so on, radiation, as you mentioned. So it's really connecting different fields, I would say. So there's a lot of interesting physics. So then, Maurizio, maybe as a last topic, I remember, like you mentioned, you did some also teaching and supervision of students and so on, and you actually enjoyed particularly this thing. And I also did, to be honest. It's really something that gives value to your PhD or to your career as an early researcher. And so what do you think about that? So how do you approach the supervision of students? So when the students come to you, how do you define the project and so on? So do you have ideas overall? Do you adjust the project depending on the student? It's a really general question.
Yeah, right. So I said I really enjoyed supervising students and during my PhD, and I'm still doing now as a postdoc at the University of York. This is something that I like. I like for several reasons. Usually what I do is to define a project for students, or they think about the project, and I try to make this project as clear as possible. Uh, and then, of course, when the student comes, then we discuss about the project, and then if he or she has sort of likes to do something different, or slightly different, or more or less, etc., we can adjust together the project to make it more suitable to the student, because then in the end it's a student project. So we always try to agree with the student and on the project before, and uh, of course, then when we define a project, we never know how it's going to be at the end, because it's still something that is research. So I don't have an answer. It's just okay. There is a project. Let's do a project, or let's see if the student is able to come with new ideas, how to solve problems, etc. But in the meantime, there might be other issues coming in, or maybe, for instance, more difficult than what we thought at the beginning, or more or easier, and therefore we can do more, etc. So the project is sort of evolving, depending also on the progress that the student makes throughout the period. So yes, it's an evolving project.
This is something I sometimes, find difficult. So how much autonomy you give to a student, and how much you try to guide the student with a sort of predefined research questions or tasks that he or she has to do. It's not so easy, in my
It is
opinion.
not easy. It is not easy. Well, and that's why I think that even that supervising a student is something good for us to learn first,
Yeah,
because
true.
we can learn a lot from this experience, and from, of course, from a professional point of view, but also from a personal point of view. Like, interacting with the student might come with some challenging that we have to face, and this is something that can really make you then a better person, and more than a better physicist. So it's actually something very very interesting. Well, at the beginning, in the first phase, I always try to guide as much as possible students, so that they can uh, build on some baseline task,
Yeah.
or something that can use them to exploit more difficult stuff, etc. So I try to guide the student as much as possible in the first phase, and then I do the opposite in the second phase, try to give them as much freedom as possible, so that they can explore what they like more, and they can have new ideas. They can even modify the project as they like. So giving them a lot of freedom, because I feel like, okay, in the end, this is their project, so I think they should be able to decide what they like more. And but of course, this also depends on the student. So if the student is want to work a lot in autonomy, then okay, that's good. Just keep an eye what he's doing, but then let's give them the possibility to work in autonomy. If the student prefer to interact more because they feel like, okay, depends on the character of the student, then okay, that's also good, because interacting with the student, you can learn. You can, for instance, discover new issues that you didn't think before. So at least for me, it's more like sort of like an evolving process. I don't know if for you guys it's the same, but I would say that for me it's really an evolving process. Yeah.
Oh, I do have to say, like, on this topic, that while I also love having students, and I love having supervising different projects, I'll just sort of play the devil's advocate here and say that from a supervisory point of view, it does take a lot of
It takes
time
time. Yeah.
and effort and consideration for even just a single student. And I know some professors have, like, multiple, like 10 students under them, and it gets very demanding in time. So how do you balance that, right? The amount of effort that it takes to make a good student project and make them feel like this is their project and they have say in what that comes out, versus balancing all of your own obligations as well.
Well, it depends on the number of students. 10 is really a lot.
Right? Yeah, no, I know, but
10
even
students
for
after.
one, right? Like, it is still a large amount of time. Yeah.
Yeah, so usually I try to have not more than 2 students at the same time. Actually, like, one is perfect, two is still good, when you go above 2, then at least for me, it becomes sort of difficult to then keep doing your work. And then I try that, but that as you said, it's very difficult because you have to do your work just to follow the students. And yeah, and then I also try to combine what I'm doing to what they are doing, so that not something completely separates, that I have to sort of keep jumping from one thing to another, but can be some project that is an auxiliary project, something that I want to explore by myself, but didn't have really time to do that. So, okay, so let's define a project, have a student, and let's sort of work together, at least for as much as possible, and then try to keep, I don't know, the project within what I have to do, so that it's not departing too much. But of course, that's I agree. I mean, it's a time involving. Supervising the students is sort of time involving, and but I think I still like doing that. So
I mean, I agree. It's a rewarding process, right? Like the amount that you get out of it is usually worth the effort. But I also know, let's say, other PhD students when I was doing my PhD, and even professors or senior staff researchers who kind of, shy away from taking on students due to the amount of time it takes. And so it's a bit unfortunate, because that means that there's less opportunities for students, but also I can see their point of view that it does take a lot of time, right? So do you think that there is a way to kind of let's say bridge that gap, or are there just certain people who are motivated to have students, and then others that just don't, right? And that's okay too, right?
I think so. I think there are some people that like more having students, and others that prefer to work by their own and not having students. And I think that's okay. I mean, as long as we have both in the community, that's perfect. I mean, then supervising a master student project is something, or a student project usually. Then supervising a PhD student is another story,
Right.
And I think that is much more involving, and I can see that as really. I mean, if you think about, okay, I want to supervise a PhD student project, then you really need to, I mean, have in mind what the student is going to doing, and this I think it's very much involving. And so let's say that even if you supervise a master student, it's still involving, but to some extent, I mean, it's limited in time. And if it's becoming too much time consuming, you can always try to reduce the project, or try to give the student more freedom to work on it, etc. But if now is a PhD student project, there you need to stay there until the end. And if there are some issues, well, you have to solve them with the student. There is no way you can escape from this. So I can also see the point of some perhaps more senior scientists that want to shy away from that, because it's like, okay, that sounds like can be sort of scary, and very demanding, depending on the evolution of the project. And this is a multi-year project, so you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, but in some respect, this also applies to teaching, right? Because you can think, I mean, when do you define that this is worth the time that you're spending, and the effort and so on, and it's not too much, or is not distracting you too much? It's difficult to set the boundary as for the number of students, 2, 3, and so on, or I spend this amount of time per week. I think also for teaching is very difficult, right? So do you think it's worth the effort, or not, and in which extent?
I think there is no clear boundary. I mean, it really depends on people. I guess it's something personal. I know some people really, they don't like teaching, and they consider teaching as a completely waste of time. And I'm okay. I mean, I like teaching, so I like to teach and interact with the students, and it's something that I enjoy. And even if I'm maybe using some of my time not doing research but teaching, well, for me it is a good way to sort of grow personally. And I think that the time I spend teaching and supervising students, is not a waste. At least from my opinion, in my opinion, is not a wasted time, because I'm always learning something. Well, I'm subtracting time to research, I know, but I think it's something really personal. So I don't know, guys, what you think about teaching, but I really like that, and I think I can, if I have the opportunity, then keep doing that in future as well.
Well, there's an interesting thing sort of like floating around here in Eindhoven, but I don't know about the rest of Europe, is to sort of redefine the metrics of defining like what is a good researcher, right? There was some ideas that they should include the number of students you mentor, supervise, or classes you teach, along with the number of publications you have, because then I imagine there are some scientists who would love to spend their effort, doing education and bringing on more students, and sharing their passion for the topic with them, but they're not incentivized to do so because it's not how they get their money or they get their fame or whatever it is, right? So it's an interesting thing. And do you think that those type of initiatives would be interesting to have, or should education just be its reward on its own, that you should do it if you love it and that's enough?
Well, again, I think this is something personal, so this is simply my opinion. I think that having the education in the research curriculum, if you want, in the research career, it is something good and should be evaluated. This is my opinion. Because I mean, it also shows that you are able to guide the project, guide some students, and perhaps be, the principal investigator or something, or the leader of a project. So you can build some expertise on supervising students that, for instance, you can't build if you're just alone working by yourself. Maybe you are publishing a lot of papers just because you are keep working on one single subject, and you are the super expert of that subject, and you don't want to spend time like teaching other people. You are the expert and so on, so you want to publish. But on the other hand, you don't really build the ability of leading a project, of interacting with other people. And there are cases where it's not simple at all interacting with other people, because they have their own opinion, and sometimes it's different than your opinion, but you need to agree, I mean, before even starting discussing about the project and so on. So I would say so, but again, this is just my opinion. It would be nice to have also your opinion there.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good point, because yeah, I think you're right. This shows also ability of guiding people, or even bringing forward your ideas. Because if you propose a project to a student and then it's successful, it's also a very good mark in your CV as well, if we want to think in that term about building your career. So that is true. I always thought in a sort of passionate way, the way you're teaching, the way you're interacting with students, even younger. But you're right. It's also a way to show that you're building your career, that you have like kind of leadership skills. So yeah, true. I never thought in that respect. That's
Yeah, because I mean, I agree with at least putting forward some other metric of identifying good scientists from just not regular scientists, and because this whole publication thing, while it's okay, it's a number that they can measure, it's not always the full picture of what people are involved with inside science. So now, whether or not including the number of students you mentored is the right metric, I have no idea, but at least something on the side of like the educational aspect, giving back to the students or to the community in another form. I think it's a good idea to start trying to include, but of course, what the final thing looks like, I also can't say, right?
Yeah, true. Of course, I mean, the problem is a bit, in my opinion, also the weight that you put these different skills or activities, right? So, for example, if you don't publish papers for 2-3 years, is it the same as if you don't supervise the students for 2-3 years? So I think it depends probably on the role that you are applying or the role that you want to do. Because I don't know, if you work, for example, in a research institute, then maybe it's more important to have output to get some fundings and so on. This is very strong. If you work at university, maybe it's also good. Well, you know, but also what I don't know.
Yeah. It's hard to say exactly.
It's very hard to say. I'm not so sure, in fact.
Yeah, but I think it's valuable to have the conversation, you know, to sort of like put your ideas out there on this aspect, because I do think it's time for a bit of change on how we evaluate a scientist, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, true. Okay, but that's very interesting. Maurizio, I really appreciated our conversation. You brought forward very interesting topics, a lot of new topics for me, at least. And I'm glad that we met already. And yeah, thank you again. Thank you, Aaron, as well, for supporting the conversation.
Oh, no, it was very educational for me. I enjoyed it a lot.
I see. Okay. Okay, and then
if even just to listen to Luca's questions, you know.
Yeah, excellent. Okay.
Well, thank you guys for inviting me. I mean, really enjoyed being here and trying to sort of answer the question as much as possible in the simple terms, and also try to sort of give also my opinion on different subjects. This one we just spoke about. So the teaching and supervising was really a pleasure to have this discussion with you, and really appreciate it.
Okay, and then with this, thank you again and see you soon. Yeah, stay tuned.